Growing up, I was the kind of kid who set 3 alarms. Not because I was afraid of oversleeping, but because I genuinely could not afford to. My parents ran a small landscaping business out of our garage in Tucson, and by the time I was 14, I already knew how to read an invoice, sort receipts into folders by month, and remind my dad which clients hadn't paid yet. Nobody asked me to do that. I just did it because that's who I was. That's who I'd always been. My brother, on the other hand, was the kind of kid who lost his lunch money on the first day of school every single year and somehow turned it into a funny story by dinner. His name is Connor. He's 3 years younger than me, and from the time he was small, everything about him was effortless. He was charming in the way that made teachers smile even when he hadn't done his homework. He was funny at the exact right moments. He could walk into a room and become the center of it without trying. And my parents, I think they just loved watching him do that. They could not get enough of it. I'm not saying they didn't love me. I want to be clear about that, because I've spent a long time being honest with myself about this. They loved me. But they loved me the way you love a good appliance, reliably, without much ceremony, because it's always just there and working. Connor? They loved the way people love a sunset, with their full attention, with this soft kind of awe. I noticed it young. I just didn't let myself say it out loud. When Connor wanted to play travel baseball at 13, my parents drove him 3 hours each way to tournaments without a single complaint. I was 15 at the time, working weekends at a smoothie place near our neighborhood, saving up for a used graphing calculator for AP chemistry. I never asked them to drive me anywhere. I figured out the bus schedule myself. When Connor got a C- in English junior year and almost didn't graduate on time, my parents hired him a tutor, extended his curfew so he could study, and took him to dinner to celebrate when he pulled his grade up to a B. I got a full academic scholarship to the University of Arizona that same month. My mom said, "That's great, honey," and then asked if I could wash the dog that weekend because she and my dad were taking Connor to a baseball tournament in Phoenix. I told myself that was fine. That's what I did for a long time. I told myself it was fine. I graduated in 3.5 years, double major in accounting and finance, no student debt, a job offer already in hand at a mid-sized firm in Phoenix. My parents came to my graduation. My mom cried a little. My dad squeezed my shoulder and said he was proud of me. It was a good day. A genuinely good day. I moved to Phoenix that August. Got a small one-bedroom in Tempe, close enough to downtown to be convenient, far enough to be affordable. I was 23 years old, and I was doing it completely on my own. I paid my rent, my car insurance, my health insurance, my groceries, my student loan from a private loan I'd taken junior year when the scholarship money didn't quite cover living expenses. I budgeted every single paycheck on a spreadsheet. I was not scraping by. I was deliberate. Connor, at 20, was still at home. He'd started community college twice and dropped out twice. He was working part-time at my dad's landscaping business, but even that was mostly flexible around whenever he wanted to sleep in or hang out with his friends. My parents had covered his car, his phone plan, his car insurance, and his gym membership for years at that point. I had paid for all of those things myself since I was 19. Again, I told myself it was fine. Here's the part I need you to understand before I tell you what happened. I had been doing well at the firm for about a year and a half. I got a raise in the spring, not enormous, but meaningful. Enough that I started putting a little extra into savings each month. Started thinking about eventually buying a condo. I was 24. I felt, for the first time in my adult life, like I had just a tiny bit of room to breathe. That October, my parents called me to tell me they wanted to do something special for Connor's 21st birthday. A surprise party. Nice restaurant downtown, our extended family coming in from out of town, the whole thing. They wanted me to come back to Tucson for the weekend. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He's my brother. The party was at a steakhouse on a Saturday night, 23 people. My parents had rented out a private dining room, open bar, 3-course dinner. I watched the bill come at the end of the night, and I am not exaggerating when I say it was close to $4,000. I didn't say anything. I helped clean up the centerpieces. I drove my grandmother back to her hotel. The next morning, my parents asked me to stay for brunch. Just the 4 of us. My dad made eggs. My mom had coffee. It felt normal. Easy. Almost like being a kid again. And I let myself relax into it. After we ate, my dad pushed back from the table and said, "We've got a little something extra for Connor." I thought it was going to be cash. A watch, maybe. My uncle had given him a nice watch the night before, and I figured my parents might do something similar. My dad nodded at my mom, and she got up and walked to the hallway. She came back holding a set of keys. Not house keys. Car keys. She set them on the table in front of Connor, and she said, and I remember this exactly, "We're proud of you, baby. 21 is a big deal." The keys had a Jeep logo on them. Connor's face broke open. He started laughing, stood up, hugged my mom, hugged my dad. They were all laughing. I sat there smiling because I didn't know what else to do with my face. A brand new Jeep Wrangler. I found out later it was just under $42,000. I sat in that kitchen and smiled and said, "That's so cool, Connor," and I meant it in a surface way. I did. I wasn't going to make his birthday about me. I wasn't that person. But I sat with it on the drive back to Phoenix. I sat with it for a long time. My parents hadn't paid for my car. I'd bought it myself at 22, used a 2019 Honda Civic with 44,000 miles on it. Paid cash with money I'd saved for 2 years. Nobody had handed me keys to anything. That would have been enough to just quietly hurt and let go of. But it wasn't the end of the conversation. 3 weeks later, my mom called me on a Tuesday night. I was making dinner and I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. She told me that the landscaping business was going through a rough patch. Summer had been slower than expected, and they'd taken on a big commercial contract that ended up falling through. They had some credit card debt they were trying to manage. She said it with this careful, apologetic tone, and something in my stomach tightened before she even got to the point. Then she said, "We were hoping you might be able to help us with some of the household bills for a little while. Just until things stabilize." I asked her what she meant by some of the bills. She said they were thinking around $800 a month. Just temporarily. I want to be accurate here, because I think the number matters. My take-home at that point was right around $400–200 a month after taxes and benefits. My rent was $1,400. My car payment was $310. Insurance, utilities, groceries, loan payment. The rest of it. I had maybe $400–500 of real breathing room each month. $800 would have wiped that out and then some. I would have been going backward. I said that to her gently. I said I wasn't sure I could do 800, that my own margins were tighter than they might realize. There was a pause, and then she said, "We just thought, since you're doing so well." I said, "Mom, you bought Connor a $42,000 Jeep 3 weeks ago." Another pause. She said, "That was a gift. That's different." I said, "I understand that. But I'm struggling to understand how the money is there for a Jeep and a $4,000 birthday party, but not for the bills." Her voice got a little cooler. She said, "We're not asking Connor because he's not in a position to help. You are." And I sat there in my kitchen, pasta water starting to boil behind me, and I felt something click into place. Something I had been refusing to name for years. I was not the daughter who was going to get a Jeep. I was the daughter who was going to be asked to cover the gap left behind by the Jeep. Those were always going to be my two different roles, and my parents saw absolutely nothing wrong with that. I told her I needed to think about it. She said okay, and we hung up. I didn't eat dinner that night. I sat on my couch for a long time and let myself be really honest, maybe for the first time, about what my family had always expected from me and what they had never once thought to question. The next morning, I called her back. I told her I wasn't able to send $800 a month. I told her I had run the numbers, and it genuinely wasn't possible without compromising my own financial stability. I told her I was sorry the business was struggling, and I meant that. I offered to look at their books with them if they wanted, to help them find places to cut costs, because that's the kind of help I could actually give. She thanked me in a very thin voice and said she'd talk to my dad. What came next was not a conversation. It was a siege. My dad called the next evening. He was not shouting, but there was this low, tightly controlled frustration in his voice that I hadn't heard since I was a teenager, and he'd found out I dented the car. He told me the family came first. He told me that they had sacrificed a lot to raise me and that this was a time when family came together. I asked him how Connor was contributing. My dad said that wasn't the point. I said that wasn't the point. I said, very calmly, "It kind of feels like the point." He said I had always had a problem with my brother, that I'd always resented Connor for things that weren't his fault. I told him I didn't resent Connor. I told him I resented being handed a different set of rules my entire life, and then being expected to be cheerful about it. He hung up. My aunt texted me the next day, my mom's sister, to tell me that my parents were really hurt, that they'd given me so much and couldn't believe I wouldn't help them in their time of need. I stared at that text for a long time. My aunt had been at Connor's birthday dinner. She had watched my parents hand him those keys. She had not texted me anything that night. My mom stopped calling for a week. When she did call again, the tone had shifted. She wasn't asking anymore. She told me that she had spoken to some people. She was vague about who. And that what I was doing was selfish. That I had forgotten where I came from. That she had expected more from me. I had expected more from her for 25 years, but I had never said it out loud, so I guess we were finally even. I blocked my aunt's number. I kept my parents' contact on, but I stopped picking up every call. I started only responding to texts when I felt ready. Then my cousin reached out, then my dad's brother. Then someone I hadn't spoken to since high school who apparently ran in the same circles as my parents' friends. All of them had some version of the same message, that I was being cold, that family was family, that money wasn't worth this. Nobody asked me what had actually happened. They had already gotten the version where I was the one who had turned my back on struggling parents. I want to tell you about a specific moment, because I think it matters. About 6 weeks after the initial phone call, I was at work on a Wednesday afternoon when my direct supervisor stopped by my desk and asked if I had a minute. I followed her to a small conference room, and she told me that someone had called the firm's main line and spoken to the front desk. The person had identified themselves as a family friend. They had suggested that I had a history of financial dishonesty, that I had problems with money that the firm might want to be aware of. My supervisor made it very clear that no one at the firm took the call seriously. She said it with a kind of careful professionalism that I appreciated, but she also wanted me to know it had happened. I sat across the table from her and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not shame, not fear. Just a tremendous, exhausted clarity. I drove home that afternoon with the window down even though it was November and cold. I called my best friend Lena and I told her everything from the beginning. She listened without interrupting, which was exactly what I needed. When I was done, she said, "Okay, what do you need to actually do here?" That was the right question. The first thing I did was document everything. I went through my phone and screenshotted every text from the last 2 months. I wrote down dates and summaries of every phone call I could remember. I sent myself an email with all of it time-stamped. I wasn't sure what I would ever need it for. I just felt better having it. The second thing I did was send my parents one final message. Not a long one. I told them that contacting my workplace was a line that could not be uncrossed. I told them I was not going to be sending financial support. I told them that I hoped they found their way through the business difficulties, and I told them that I needed space from contact for a while, and that I'd reach out when I was ready. I sent it on a Thursday evening. Then I put my phone face down on the coffee table and watched 2 episodes of a show I'd been meaning to get to, and I made myself a bowl of soup, and I did not pick the phone back up until the next morning. There were 14 unanswered messages by then. I read them. I didn't respond to any of them. The weeks that followed were strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not painful, exactly. More like walking through a house with all the furniture rearranged. I knew the space, but I kept reaching for things that weren't where I expected them. I had built so much of my identity around being the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who handled things. It turned out that when you step out of that role, you have to figure out who you are without it. That's not a comfortable process. I'm not going to make it sound like it was. There were nights I second-guessed myself. I'd lie in bed replaying conversations, wondering if I'd been too cold, too rigid, if I had some blind spot I couldn't see. I talked to Lena a lot during this period. I started seeing a therapist in January, someone I found through my company's employee assistance program, a woman named Dr. Ellison who had this way of asking questions that made me think 3 levels deeper than I expected. She asked me once, about 2 months in, whether I thought I had ever been given permission to disappoint my family. I thought about it for a long time. Then I said no. She said, "What do you think would have happened if you had disappointed them earlier?" I said I didn't know. That maybe nothing dramatic. That maybe I'd just been carrying a fear that was never actually tested. She nodded and wrote something down. By March, something had shifted. The calls had slowed to once every week or two. My mom texted occasionally, not the loaded, pressuring texts from before, but smaller things. A photo of the dog. A mention that the business had brought on a new commercial client. I didn't read too much into it. I responded briefly and warmly and kept my distance. Connor called me in April. I picked up, because Connor and I had never really fought. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I heard what happened." I said, "What did you hear?" He said he'd heard they'd asked me for money and that I'd said no and things had gone sideways. He sounded genuinely uncertain about how to frame it, like he wasn't sure whose version was right. I gave him mine. Just the facts, the ask, the amount, the birthday party, the Jeep, the call to my office. There was a long silence. Then he said, "I didn't know they called your work." I said, "I know." He said he was sorry, not on their behalf. He was clear about that. He said sorry the way you say it when something happened near you that you didn't stop and probably should have. I appreciated it more than I told him. We talked for almost an hour. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Maybe ever. He told me things had been tense at home. That the business was genuinely struggling. That he was trying to pick up more hours. That he felt guilty about the Jeep, even though he hadn't asked for it. I told him he didn't need to feel guilty for something they chose to do. I told him I didn't blame him. By the time we hung up, something between us had quietly repaired. Summer came. I got a second raise. Not huge, but it felt enormous to me in that moment, because I had earned it in a year where I had also been holding 1,000 other things. I went to Colorado with Lena in July, and we hiked until my legs ached, and I ate too much at a barbecue place in Denver, and I slept 9 hours a night for 4 days straight. It was the most rested I had felt in years. I let myself think about what I wanted. Not what was responsible or what made sense or what anyone needed from me. Just what I wanted. I wanted a condo with a little patio. I wanted to learn to make bread. I wanted a dog, eventually. I wanted to dog eventually. I wanted to wake up on Saturdays and feel like the day belonged to me. None of those things are remarkable. But they felt remarkable because for a long time, I had been so busy being reliable that I had stopped checking in with myself about any of it. My parents and I moved towards something that I won't call reconciliation yet, but might be the beginning of one. My mom called me in August and her voice was different, softer, and also a little tired in a way that felt honest rather than manipulative. She said she had been thinking about the spring. She said she didn't think they had handled it well. She didn't specifically address the call to my firm. I noticed that. I filed it away. I told her I appreciated that. I told her I loved them. I told her I was also still working through some things and that I hoped we could take it slowly. She said okay. That was something. I've spent a lot of time over the past year sitting with a question that I don't think has a clean answer. Why did it take this long? Why did I spend a decade being quietly resentful and never say a word? Never ask for anything different? Never let myself need them to show up the way they showed up for Connor? Part of it was fear, the way Dr. Ellison identified. Part of it was pride. I didn't want to need things. Part of it was something harder to name. I think I believed, somewhere underneath everything, that my value in my family was conditional. That I was worth keeping around because I was useful and dependable and never made things harder. And if I let myself have needs or limits or complaints, I might find out that the love underneath was smaller than I'd hoped. The thing I had to learn, and I'm still learning it, is that testing that theory is the only way to actually find out. You cannot know what someone will love you through until you give them something to love you through. My family let me down in some significant ways this year. That's real, and I'm not going to soften it. But the thing they also gave me, without meaning to, was a reason to finally stop performing and start existing. To stop being the responsible one as an identity and start being a person who happens to be responsible when she chooses to be, on her own terms. I drove myself to work this morning. I made coffee in my own kitchen, in my own apartment. And I drank it by the window while the sun came up over the parking lot. Not glamorous, but mine. Completely, uncomplicatedly mine. I'm not waiting for anyone to hand me the keys to anything. I've been making my own set for a long time. I just finally figured out what door they open. I've thought a lot about why it took me so long to say no. Not the specific no. I finally said to my parents about the $800, but all the smaller ones I never said before that. The ones I swallowed at 14 when I figured out the bus schedule myself. The ones I quietly set aside at graduation when my mom said, "That's great, honey," and moved on. Every time I told myself it was fine when it wasn't, I was making a choice. I just didn't think of it as one. That's the part that sat with me hardest after everything settled down. Not the Jeep. Not the phone call to my firm, as enraging as that was. It was the realization that I had been a willing participant in my own disappearing act for years. I had made myself easy to overlook by never asking to be seen. I thought I was being strong. I was actually just being quiet. Connor didn't do anything wrong. I want to keep saying that because I mean it. He was handed something he didn't ask for, by parents who loved him in a particular way that didn't require anything from him. That's not a character flaw. That's just what he was given. The difference between us was never really about who worked harder or who deserved more. It was about who my parents thought needed protecting, and who they thought could handle being left to figure it out. I was always going to be the second one. I understand that now. What I also understand is that being capable does not mean being available. Those are two different things, and for a long time, I confused them. I was capable, so I made myself available. For the receipts, for the problem solving, for the financial gap my parents assumed I could fill because I had filled every other gap before it. The trouble with being reliable is that people stop asking if you're okay. They just assume. And if you never correct them, the assumption calcifies into expectation and eventually into entitlement. Dr. Ellison asked me once if I thought I had ever given myself permission to need things. I said no without hesitating. What I've learned since then is that need isn't weakness. It's information. It tells you what matters and where your limits actually are, not where you've been pretending they are. I had been running at capacity for years and calling it fine. When my parents asked for $800 a month, they weren't just asking for money. They were asking me to keep performing a version of myself that I had already outgrown. And I finally couldn't do it. I'm not where I want to be yet. I still catch myself over-explaining, over-justifying, bracing for disappointment when I say no to something. Old habits. But I wake up in the mornings now, and the day belongs to me in a way it never quite did before. I made that happen, not by being harder or colder or more distant, but by being honest, maybe for the first time, about what I actually had to give and what I didn't. That honesty cost me something real. It also gave me something I didn't know I'd been missing, the quiet, solid feeling of living inside a life I actually chose. I'm still building it, but it's mine.